The Park at Midnight, a short, scary story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by Robin McConnell. Honestly, until the thing with Stephen Meller, I'd never understood how people managed to be scared of ghosts. Monsters I could understand, serial killers even more so. Monsters like werewolves and vampires had huge tearing teeth and ripping claws, whilst serial killers, even fictional ones, thrust with their horribly pointed kitchen knives or smacked their lips at the thought of devouring you. I could even understand people feeling creeped out by aliens and the kind of mutant creatures and robots you see in sci-fi. To me, being scared of all that stuff made sense. But ghosts? Perhaps it was the tangibility of the others, the idea that monsters and aliens, if real, could actually do you harm in the physical world, that they were in some way more solid and physically threatening in a literal, touchable way. I could understand being scared of that, but bedsheets going woo like a boiling kettle, or ghoulies and dead people creeping around in churchyards on tiptoe, just didn't cut the mustard. When I heard reports of plates and furniture flying around, I assumed it was a domestic, not a poltergeist. Christ knows my wife has thrown some crockery in her time. When something went bump in the night, I assumed it was either a burglar or some local pisshead too drunk to get his key in the door. Now, I'm not saying I'm impervious. I'm happy to admit that if I were ever to come face to face with someone I knew to be dead, up and walking about, it would likely give me a bit of a start. I would be scared because it was happening to me. Things are always different in person. What I could never get my head around was how people got scared of ghosts on the page, or in films, the same way they did other stuff. Even when I heard the spooky stories the other fellas told, and trust me, every copper has a few, I was just never moved. Until it came to Stephen. In some ways, I suppose the job might have numbed me. As a police officer for over 30 years, I had seen my fair share of horrible things. The ugly side of humanity was laid bare for me daily. I had also, I'm sorry to say, seen my fair share of dead bodies. All of them stiff, inanimate, and although sobering in a remember your fate kind of way, no more terrifying than the kitchen table or any other hard, unmoving thing. Whatever it was, the thing with Stephen cut through that numbness like a red-hot poker. Now I am scared of ghosts. Not only because I know they're real, but more importantly, because I know what they can do. I had known of Stephen for almost a decade. Though we worked on the same force and had a nodding acquaintance, we had never actually been in the same department or even on similar shifts until about a year before it happened. When we finally did end up working together, me as a sergeant, him as a detective constable working under my supervision, I found him to be an amiable and straight-talking kind of bloke. He was also a bloody good copper. Or so I thought. So it was with some surprise that I met the question he posed to me one October morning about securing a restraining order. He had asked to see me the day before, but my schedule had been full, so I'd penciled him in for the following morning. When he arrived at the office, his usual awkwardly pleasant grin was missing, and there was something in the way his eyes never stayed still that made me nervous. There was something in the furtive, restless glances as if searching the shadows of the room, expecting at every moment someone or something to jump out at him, that was deeply unsettling. Not at this point because I was afraid for myself, but because I was naturally concerned for one of my officers. I had seen changes like this in people before. Officers who usually came in whistling a happy tune grown suddenly morose, often due to the demands of the job. The things we see, whilst they don't always impact us immediately, take their toll. My own captain explained it to me years ago as being like snow. A single snowflake falling on a branch is almost imperceptible, but pile enough of those flakes make a thick, accumulated pile of snow, and eventually, the branch will snap under the weight. Even before Stephen spoke, I was already going through my mental Rolodex searching for the names of therapists I might refer him to. What he actually asked, however, threw me totally off balance. I wanted to ask Sarge, how do you go about getting a restraining order? The question struck me as odd. Firstly, because I assumed that as a long-serving officer he would already know the answer, or at least know how to ask about it other than his immediate superior. Secondly, because of the other details he shared, I suppose it was at that point that I began to suspect that all was not well with Stephen Meller. There was something unnervingly calculated about the way he steered the conversation. In the course of our 20-minute chat, he seemed very keen to repeat certain points, labouring them almost to the point of excess, as if trying to ensure that I remembered them later. I had interviewed enough perps to spot someone trying to signpost their way through a story, leaving obvious breadcrumbs, building alibis, and littering their statements with key phrases their lawyer had instructed them to include and ensure that they got on record. It's hard to explain, but for a long-time copper, the experience is like dancing with someone and have them fight you to take the lead, as if they are struggling to guide and steer you in certain premeditated directions. That conversation with Stephen felt the same, as if there was some blueprint he was working to. I noticed this, and although I didn't say anything about it at the time, I knew that I didn't like it. According to him, for the last month he had been receiving phone calls from a woman named Donna Lambert. A woman I had heard of previously, owing to her ridiculous insistence that she was a medium or psychic, and credulity was given to her so-called abilities by some of my colleagues. Around the division, Miss Lambert was somewhere between an urban myth and a joke. On several occasions, she had called the front desk with what she described as pertinent information about ongoing cases. At first, she was dismissed as a crank to be filed away alongside the scores of other nut jobs who call in every full moon, confessing to all manner of non-existent crimes. For a time, she was humoured but politely ignored. Until, she started to be right. Dozens of coppers working in our neck of the woods would swear on their children's lives that Mad Donna had helped them with a case, either by giving them a steer in the right direction or, some cases, by identifying the guilty party and pointing the way to evidence that would help to convict them. Obviously, like all policemen's stories, the tales got embellished, and by the time they were recounted in the local pub, Madame Lambert the Extraordinary was staring into a crystal ball and giving the home address of Jack the Ripper, but no doubt there was a grain of truth to the stories. Hearing Miss Lambert's name in this context was highly surprising. According to Stephen, Mad Donna had been calling him twice a night for the past month. She had even called the mobile phone given him for duty, the number for which he had not shared with anyone outside of the department, and which he had no idea how she had obtained. "Maybe she's psychic," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. Stephen didn't laugh. Instead, he simply continued with his complaint, reeling off occasions and inconvenient moments at which Mad Donna had called him and revealing how his wife was becoming increasingly agitated about it. Even whilst revealing these details, however, Stephen seemed somehow off, and again my policeman's spider sense began to tingle. Whenever a natural link in a chain is omitted by someone making a statement, that link immediately stands out as important. In Stephen's case, I instantly noticed that although he complained of the times and frequency of these calls, he never disclosed what they were actually about, or even a single word of what was said. I decided not to press this, gave Stephen some advice on how to go about taking the measures he wished to take, and advised him that he would need to show some reason and indeed evidence to justify a restraining order. We shared pleasantries, and he left. Within an hour, I began my own inquiries. Martin Doc Doherty had been a colleague and close personal friend of mine for many years. He also happened to be the shift supervisor for one Stephen Meller. Later that same day, I asked Doc to come see me so I could find out a little more about Stephen and what was going on. As soon as the name left my lips, there was an acknowledgement from Doc in the form of a heavy sigh and a weary shake of his head. "There's something not right with that lad," was his immediate response. "He's been getting these phone calls from that psychic lady, you know." I nodded that I had heard as much, and Doc went on. "Never mentions what they're about, though, does he?" he said, with a level of perceptiveness that made me smile internally, though I maintained a straight face. "No, seems a bit odd, doesn't it?" I replied. Doc nodded, and closing the door of the office behind him, ensuring that he couldn't be heard, took a seat opposite me at my desk. "Thing is, Sarge, Stephen's been a bit off these past few weeks. I spoke to his wife not a fortnight ago and just happened to ask her what the phone calls were about. Apparently, she had overheard a few of them with some woman, that's the way she described it, some woman screaming down the phone and saying over and over that he knows and that Stephen needed to confess. At first, she blushed to admit this, mind you, but at first she thought it was an affair, that he was some disgruntled partner and that Stephen was being urged to confess to her, but then he had explained who exactly was calling. Apparently, it was doing their marriage no good at all. I nodded at this, but decided that I needed to press Doc a little further. "So what is it that you think has been odd about him?" At this, Doc looked uncomfortable and squirmed a little in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck with his hand in the way he always did when he was nervous. "Well," he began cautiously, "a few weeks back there was a report that some youths were causing trouble on Landale Park. They were drinking and had apparently set one of the bins on fire. Stephen was asked to go up there and sort these idiots out, or at least tell them to get home, which he said he had. Problem is, when I checked the next day, Stephen hadn't actually gone up there at all. His car was seen on the other side of town, and more calls came in about these idiots. Well, at first I thought it was a mistake, so I asked one of his partners about it. Come to find out, Stephen never goes up there. Apparently, umpteen times there have been reports of things happening near that park, and on every occasion, Stephen has either ended up busy on another case, or just didn't turn up at all. The other coppers have been covering him for months, and they even make a joke about it, saying that he's scared of the ghosts." "Ghosts?" I asked, surprised, as Doc again gripped the back of his neck. "Yeah," he went on gingerly. "Apparently, when you go up to Landale Park late on, like midnight, sometimes there's a boy sitting on the swing." Doc followed this with a long pause, which I left empty, in order to encourage him to go on. "A few of my lads have mentioned it. They'd be doing a slow circuit around the estates and would drive past Landale Park. You know the place, it's basically a bit of rough ground and grass that the council have put a slide and a few swings upon." I nodded that I knew the place and indeed visualized it in my mind. The park was fringed with trees and marked the boundary between two overspill estates. On one side was a large open grass area where people tended to walk their dogs or play football on a Sunday, and closer to the tree line was a slide, an old metal roundabout, some monkey bars, and the swings that Doc was talking about. The swings themselves consisted of a metal frame, the swing seat suspended by thick metal chains that were freezing to hold in winter, whilst the seat was essentially a sling of hard black plastic. I had driven by the place many times, but I had never seen a boy, nor could I see at this point how the story linked back to Stephen. Doc went on. "A few times folks have ridden out there and, well, they've seen a boy." "A boy?" I asked, wondering where this was going and wondering for a moment whether Doc might be pulling my leg. One look at his face, however, and I knew immediately that there was no humour in his words. His face had gone a peculiar ashen grey, as if with each word he spoke, another degree of the colour that usually warmed his complexion escaped through his mouth with it. His voice, too, had lost its usual assertive push, and now seemed thin and somehow forced, as if he were having great trouble even approaching the subject. At first, He just nodded, then, realizing I needed more to go on, pressed his throat into action. "Yes, sir," he finally muttered quietly. "A boy just sat there, on the swing. Everything else is pitch black. Obviously it's the middle of the night and there's nobody else about except this boy. Sometimes it's just a silhouette, just the shape of a boy sitting there, swinging backward and forwards. Most times, though, he's still, just sitting there, his legs dangling and not even moving, even in the middle of winter, and you know how cold it gets up here. But he never moves. Anyway, a few of my gang have even gone so far as to get out of the car and walk over to him, to find out what the matter was, and what the hell was doing out on his own at that time of the morning. But he hesitated to swallow deeply. When they got closer, the boy had just gone. "Gone," I echoed. Doc nodded, and I could see from the tightening purse of his lips that the topic was making him feel uncomfortable. He and I had been friends for a long time. He was a man I both liked and respected, and in the many years I'd worked alongside him, he had never struck me as anything other than the straightest of arrows. Now he was sitting in front of me telling stories about vanishing boys. Sensing my incredulity, he attempted to add weight to his statements. "I've got actual reports about it," he clarified desperately. "Coppers I know well who've thought it best to write up the story just in case a boy was missing or run away from home or whatever. They've actually written it, in black and white, that they got out and walked over, and the next thing they knew, where they thought the boy had been, there was nothing. Just a dark space, a shadow that was always there. One fella said it was as if the boy just, melted into the shadow like he was part of it. Gave me the bleeding creeps, I don't mind telling you. One thing I can say, though, is that people take it seriously. It's not a joke to them." I leaned back in my chair and sighed, still reeling from the revelation that officers at my division, my officers, were taking the time to write about ghost stories and mirages. "So, what does this have to do with Stephen?" I asked, though I could already fit the pieces together and make a fairly good guess at the response. "Well, it turns out our brave Officer Mellor isn't too keen to go on calls that involve going to that park. In fact, he's never gone to one. Ever. Obviously the others have got on his case about it, but he'll never say anything. I knew nothing about this because even though they didn't like it, the others covered for him. It was only when some local idiots set the park bin on fire again that it even came to my attention. Mellor was supposed to go up there and speak to the lads who did it, but instead he just decided not to go. I got a complaint through from the fire brigade because they turned up expecting there to be police support and there was none. Turns out Mellor was still downstairs at his desk working on something else." I nodded and decided that first thing in the morning I was to have a rather extended chat with Officer Mellor. As it turned out, I never got the chance. What I did get the chance to do, however, was ride up to Lansdale Park on my way home. It was around 10 minutes out of my way, but I decided that I needed to see for myself what had put the willies up my best officer. It was around midnight when I got there. I'd clocked out at 11, run quickly to the all-night supermarket to pick up a few things, and as I was loading them into the car, decided that it might be worth swinging by. Even before I parked the car, I could see that the park was empty. The swings remained perfectly still, undisturbed even by the breeze. There is, I can happily admit, something unnerving about places that usually buzz with life when that life is removed. Look at a theme park at night or a front room scattered with toys but no children, and you see more than just the objects. There is an absence there, an emptiness or stasis. It's as if those places with the vitality removed become themselves like corpses, dead, inanimate remnants like bones or an empty shell, relics of where life once was. I'll admit those places are eerie, and on that night, having heard what I'd heard, the park was no different. In the moonlight, the grass looked almost blue, drained like the equipment of its colour and lifeblood. The equipment A slide, a roundabout, seesaw, monkey bars, and the swing stood undisturbed and silhouetted, their shapes and frames protruding from the ground like metal carcasses or the weird industrial ornaments we grew to replace the trees. Putting on my hat and leaving the car, the first thing I noticed was the stillness. The park, which stood opposite the general store that served the local estate, was a popular spot next to a relatively busy road. It was fringed on two sides by woods, but on the other, at a distance, by the gardens and fences of local houses. Never, in all of the times I had passed this place, had I ever seen it so still. Yes, the hour was late, and generally there weren't many people on the streets at this time of night, but this was different. The sound of the car door closing, not slamming, you understand, rang across the area like a clap of thunder. It echoed and reverberated into the silence like it was the first sound heard there in days. I half expected its scream to have woken the residents, but nothing, and no one stirred. Not a light shone in a window, not a dog barked, no babies cried. I saw no cats streaking across the road in half-seen flashes. Everything was a hush. Stepping onto the grass, I heard no footsteps, no traffic, no sound from the houses nearby, and considering this, I stupidly allowed the sentence to form in my mind. There seemed to be not a soul around. I let the words percolate in my mind, then admonished myself for allowing them to make me feel uneasy. "Don't be stupid," I told myself aloud, shaking my head and making the short walk toward the apparatus, but my self-scolding didn't work. Slowly, glancing at intervals between the tree line, the roundabout, and eventually the swings, I realized all at once that I was unnerved. Not only that, but looking for someone. Actively surveying the area with the expectation of finding someone there. A boy, a man, someone. Yet, as I should have expected, there was only the darkness, the dry blue blades of the grass, and the cold rigidity of the steel equipment, unused and standing like strange monoliths in a curious, uneasy arrangement. For a second, looking at these odd shapes, I considered what societies in a few millennia would make of them, were they to uncover them as we had Stonehenge or the pyramids. What meaning would they ascribe to the swings with their thick chains and plastic seat, the monkey bars like a strange H-shaped sculpture or a horizontal ladder? What significance would they see in the slide that allows the user to climb toward heaven, but inevitably always slide back to earth, or perhaps somewhere below? It was as I considered these ideas, my eyes still scanning the lines and glimmers of the metal, that for the first time since I left the car, I heard a sound around me. It had come from the tree line, the dark wall of knitted branches directly behind the swings. It was distinct, not the breaking of a branch or the fluttering of some bird disturbed from its roost. Rather, it was a soft rustling, as of bushes and leaves disturbed by something heavier than wind, something with presence, weight, and form that had pressed against them and left them to swing back into place. I watched the space and the swings themselves, the steel chain, the hard plastic seat. Nothing. Heading back to the car, I again told myself off for being so stupid, for allowing myself to be influenced by the superstitions of others, and even worse, for allowing them to actually get to me. I had just slipped my key into the lock, promising myself that I would never tell anyone that I came here, when my eyes caught sight of a shape in the wing mirror. In it, I saw a distorted view of the park, the tree line like a streak of pink, the grass a crayon scribble of differing lengths. I saw the slide, warped by the reflection, and to the left of the image, the swings, and the boy sitting upon them. I spun around in a fraction of a second and stared back at the park, at the point where the boy slumped slightly to the left, his head resting on one of the chains that supported the seat of the swing where he had been waiting, and saw nothing. Only the empty swing, moving ever so slightly. Stephen Meller did not show for work the next day. The following evening, he was found by 2 other officers. He had hanged himself from the chains that support the swing on Lansdale Park. Whilst investigating the case, a number of strange details came to light that somewhat altered my view of so-called ghosts. Firstly, there was the way in which Stephen hanged himself. Unlike most wishing to take their own lives, who might take pills or use a gun if they could get hold of one, Stephen chose to hang, but not in the way that most would imagine. Rather than taking some jerking drop with a rope that would break his neck and kill him instantly, Stephen chose to hang of a different sort. Taking the chains from 2 sets of swings, he wound them together into some sort of strange plait, wrapped the end around his throat, and then proceeded to simply sit down. The cause of death was not a broken neck, but rather slow and agonizing strangulation, as the chains tightened and tightened, leaving his body hanging pendulously, slumped forward for 2 of my other officers to find. Then there were the hours before the act. Though he had not shown for work, Stephen drove to the hardware shop at the top of Entware Road. On the CCTV, he can be seen buying the bolt cutters he used to separate the swing seat from the chains. When I asked to speak to the attendant who served him, I was told that he had taken sick and was at home that day. Naturally, I went to the man's house to interview him there, and found a pale wreck of a man. He certainly remembered Stephen coming in and selling him the bolt cutters. What he remembered more distinctly, however, was Stephen's face. "It was so weird," he said, his hands trembling as he reached for his tea. "He had this hoodie on, and when he looked up, it was like he was a man, but his face was like a kid's, as a little boy's face, sort of put on top. Do you know what I mean? It was like on top." I didn't know what he meant, but God knows in the weeks since I have imagined it. From there, Stephen can be seen on several other CCTV cameras. He left his vehicle and walked in a strange, slow meander toward the park. Reaching the swings, he sat on them and indeed swung on them for almost 20 minutes before taking the bolt cutters to the chains, winding them around his neck and sitting heavily down. Oddly, the officers who found Stephen's body both reported that from the road they had assumed the shape to be the body of a child. One of them even went so far as to specify a small boy, and recounted how they became confused when they approached and found the shape to be a fully grown man. I have never believed in ghosts, nor have I ever believed in the idea of possession. Any time I had ever heard the word before, it was in relation to demons or evil spirits occupying people's bodies. I had never even considered the idea that a so-called ghost could take control of someone's body and make them do things in the real world. But then I called Donna. Her explanation of events was far-fetched and involved events and possibilities that I, as a police officer, refused to put down in any police report. As a man, however, as someone who has to pass that park every night on my way home, my opinion is slightly different. In the course of our conversation, Donna implored me to revisit the case of a hit-and-run incident from almost 3 years earlier, in which a young boy was killed on the road close to Lansdale Park. She asked me to consider the fact that a few days after that incident, Officer Meller reported his car stolen, and indeed the remnants of the vehicle, completely burnt out, were found on the croft behind Lansdale Park. She asked me to also consider the fact that in the incident, the small boy's hoodie became caught in the wheels, and as the guilty party attempted to speed away, the boy was dragged for several minutes behind the car by his throat. She also told me, cryptically, to check Stephen's body and look closely at his clothing. something that in a bluster of dismissal I steadfastly refused to do, but later, whilst alone in the silence of the morgue, I quietly and reluctantly did. In every item of Mellor's clothing, his jeans, his t-shirt, even his underwear, and the hoodie he had been wearing when he had visited the hardware shop, a clothing label had been sewn in the manner that one would sew a label for a child to identify their PE kit. On each label, the name Arnold had been scrawled in lowercase letters in a red marker pen. A few days later, I did open the file on that hit and run. I'm sure I don't have to tell you the victim's first name, or that, nowadays, I find myself to be very much afraid of ghosts. This has been The Park at Midnight, a short, scary story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2021 by Michael van der Voort. Production copyright by Michael van der Voort.